Thank you for listening to this episode of History Exchange.
Danke, dass Sie wieder dabei sind bei dieser Episode von History Exchange.
Further information can be found on Center Austria's homepage www.centeraustria.org.
Und auf der Homepage des Instituts für Zeitgeschichte der Universität Innsbruck www.uibk.ac.at/Zeitgeschichte. Willkommen zur heutigen Folge von History Exchange. Ich bin Eva Pfanzelter und mein Interviewkollege ist
Mark Landry. Today is the 5th of May, 2023, and we are sitting in my office in the Department of History at the University of New Orleans. Our guest today is Gordon H. Nick Mueller. Gordon H. Nick Mueller, PhD, former historian and vice chancellor at the University of New Orleans, served as founding president and CEO of the National World War II Museum. During a distinguished career at UNO, Mueller made his mark as a popular teacher, dean, and administrator. He played a lead role in creating the Metropolitan College and in developing new extension and distance learning programs, the University Conference Center, Center Austria, and the International Summer School in Innsbruck, Austria. He also founded the UNO Research and Technology Park.
And besides everything else that we just heard, you have a rather close connection also with Günter Bischof, Nick.
I do.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit about Günter as a historian. How would you describe him?
Well, I think Günter is a terrific historian. He's very broadly trained. That's not the case so much anymore. But in the old days for Günter and for my profession were in the 70s and 80s. And both here, when he got his master's here, then went back to Innsbruck. I think got a magister there. And then he went to Harvard and trained under Ernie May and other great historians there. And so he's very broadly trained, both at the University of Innsbruck, University of New Orleans, and in diplomatic history at Harvard. So he has great professional credentials. He's very creative and imaginative in his historical outlook, both because of, I think, his European heritage and just his great historical imagination and creative imagination. It's one of historians that I've valued, first of all, watching him come through UNO as a grad student, and then going off getting other degrees. And then when Steve Ambrose brought him back in something of a little controversy. I mean, the chairman asked for 3 nominations, and Steve walked in. There were 3 members of the committee. He said there's only 1, which didn't sit too well with the other members of the committee who dutifully had provided 3 names. So they took Steve's nomination and nevertheless invited him to be the professor and associate director of the Eisenhower Center at that time. So, but as a historian, of course, he prospered with his own works in German, Austrian history, comparative history. I guess I should go back to unless you're going to ask me a question about how our relationship started. Is that coming soon, or is
that was going to be the next one?
Yeah,
well, so first met him. Well, it goes back to Joe Logsdon, who was one of our great early professors who was here when I came in '69, and he was teaching in Innsbruck for me one summer in '78, I guess, or '77, and then he said, we need to extend our exchange with the University of Innsbruck more than just having more students come here. So let's create a grad student position for University of Innsbruck history major. That was Günter. So as you all know, he was the first of many that followed him. But the first time I met him, I knew he'd been invited. He was the selected one, but he showed up in my office at the Studentenhaus in the summer of '79 during the program and said he was just thrilled to have this scholarship, but he had no money and no way to get to the United States to enroll in school. So I said, don't worry, Günter. I said, we have a charter plane. You show up in Munich on such and such a day at such and such a time, and I'm going to sneak you onto that charter. So anyway, so he said, really, can you do that? I said, just have your passport and everything, and we'll do it. And we did, but he was quite nervous when he got to the airport. Didn't think it would go that way. Certainly wasn't sort of the way Austrians would do things. So anyhow, he was a great student during that year. It's when we first really got to know each other. And then while he was in Innsbruck, of course, after that on his master's and when he was going home during his Harvard days, I managed to get together with him numerous times in the 80s and saw him at Harvard a couple times, go have coffee with him. So we had a good relationship. He was always championed and interested and loved the fact that we had the summer school going, because obviously it was a way for him to get back to Innsbruck and to Austria. So. And then we started working on courses together. And back in the old days when nepotism wasn't such a hard, fast rule, I managed to job my father, who was the first distinguished professor in the history department for 1 year in '78, to come over. He was a church historian, but I got him to teach Renaissance and Reformation and design a new course on the history of Tyrol, which I kind of helped him with. Of course, as you might imagine, it had a lot about the Anabaptists and the Reformation and the Renaissance thrown in, but Günter got involved with that too, and then he picked it up and started offering the South Tyrol course and the Tyrol, and then the trips down to South Tyrol and Siegfried's place, Ezra Pound, and the Agricultural Museum. And so there was a lot of collaboration between the both of us during his years before he ever even came here. And by the time he came, I think it was 87 or 86, somewhere in there, he was a very mature historian right out of grad school, and he had 2 master's degrees and was quite energetic, and working with Steve Ambrose, and also worked with him very closely then too, because of the early beginnings and ideas of that led to the D-Day Museum, it was at first called. And Steve Ambrose and I had put together this Eisenhower Center, which had a big suite of offices formerly over in the Education Building, with a conference room and a place for graduate students to work to record oral histories. And Günter was the chosen one for his associate, and he kept things moving in there, and was very, very involved in that, and published several books with LSU Press and Steve Ambrose on POWs in World War II and a number of others, and put out several volumes even after we had the idea in 1990 to do the museum. So he was involved in everything just about that I was doing and that Steve Ambrose was doing, because Steve was my best friend, and so Günter was always hooked into anything we were doing just about. So in any event, that gets us up to at least maybe your next question.
Yeah, maybe before we jump into the present time, we want to make a switch a little bit away from Günter. Mm-hmm. And my first question here would be something probably you don't expect. What is your first image that comes to your mind when you think of Austria?
Oh, that's a good question. My first image?
Yeah.
Mountains.
Mountains.
Mountains, skiing. I mean, when I was over there from 63 to 65, I skied all over the areas where I really learned to ski. And but I always loved the mountains there from youth, the age of 14 in South Tyrol, which we talked about a few moments ago, and Vilnius for the summertime, and hiking, and I just loved it. I mean, my father took me to Innsbruck from northern Germany with my younger brother in 1953, and Dad, who was the ultimate scholar and linguist and so forth. So instead of taking me on a walking tour of the Altstadt, he walked up the Rhine to Universitätsbibliothek and wandered and showed me the library when we were close to a monastery, I'd get to see those too. But that was my first memory of Innsbruck, was the Rhine and the mountains there. And then, lo and behold, 7 years later, I was over there again at the University of Vienna summer semester in Strobel am Wolfgangsee, and was back in Innsbruck and Salzburg. But the mountains, just my heart's with the mountains and with Austria. And actually, my mother discovered from Karl Ilk, someone whose name is on the plaque at the Studentenhaus, because he was the founder of the Internationale Studentenhaus for the Winter Games that I worked at for 4 months. And so I knew that building was being converted to a dormitory after the games, and it was built by the government for the games, so it was the press headquarters. And so I got back to Innsbruck right on Rhine, working for IBM Austria as a kind of a gopher, running errands for the public relations firm. But those were a great 3 months, I'll tell you. I had a press photo pass, so I could go anywhere to any Olympic site to get the results at the final competitions. And those days, they didn't trust telephones and didn't have computers, and so I had to take a little Volkswagen bus and drive down to the Studentenhaus, which was the press headquarters. So,
do you remember which event you were most interested in seeing?
Well, I liked the slalom, the downhill, but the slalom events, I was there with what's his name, Jimmy Huega, and the guy who was killed in an avalanche a few weeks later, who was our top Olympic skier. I think they were second and third, Warner. But the best was the Canadian Soviet hockey match for the gold, and I was right over the goal for that, and it was just terrific. And so anyhow, those I don't know how we got off on that subject. What was the origin of the first question?
Mountain.
Mountains.
What do you think of when you think of Austria?
Yeah. So anyway, what I wanted to tell you was that the first summer in Innsbruck in '76, I once again brought my father in to teach a few courses, and so he and my mother, both German, met in the United States in '24. My mother was Fink, and maiden name, and Karl Ilk. That's where it was. Karl Ilk was the great anthropologist, and who was the specialist in Austria for the Deutsche Auswanderung, the Österreichische Auswanderung, all over the world. And so he took me and my father and mother to lunch as we sat there up on the other side of the river at that restaurant by the Hungerburg, and looked down over the pass. And so he started talking about the history of Tyrol and asked about my mother, who was obviously German, and said, "Where are you from?" She said, "Well, my father was a Baptist preacher up in Pomerania and Stettin." But he says, "Where are you really from?" He said, "Well, my father was born in Magdeburg." And he says, "Where was he from?" "Hesse," she says. "Hesse." He said, "Well, then you're really from the Zillertal Valley, because it was full of Finks, and they were all Protestants. And after the Augsburg Confession, all the Protestants had to move because it was Catholic." And he said 95% of them went to Hesse. And her father was so he says, "Now, there's no family tree here, but you're probably a Fink from the Zillertal Valley." So it's another reason, I guess, for the mountains. And it's a beautiful valley, too. It's one of my favorites. So, but I've been all over those mountains of Tyrol and South Tyrol, and I'm not through with them yet.
Good.
Coming back to more recent times, and you founded Center Austria here at the University of New Orleans, and I think this is also a big part of your relationship with Günter. Could you tell us a little bit about creating Center Austria, the idea for that, and how you and Günter worked together on that?
Well, it started really with the Freundschaft Vertrag with the University of Innsbruck and the University of New Orleans. When Rector Andrea was the rector, I think it was 82 or 83, and Greg O'Brien was the chancellor at the time, and I wanted to expand our relationship with the University of Innsbruck. We were already hiring a few professors like Anton Pelinka and Eric Turney and a few others, but wanted to have a more substantive relationship, so we created this friendship treaty, and it obligated both universities to engage in research and student exchange, year-round exchange. You're here because of it. And so we developed an institute, first of all, for the comparative study of public policy that was run by another German extract, Werner Feld, the chairman of political science. And that went on for a number of years, and then he left, retired, and Nick Mueller took that over for a few years. But by 95, 96, the leadership there was gone, and it didn't really feel good. It was largely, that was an outgrowth of Pelinka, who was also social science, and Turney, who was an economist, and so I wanted something more in the humanities and liberal arts focused and Austria focused, basically. And so we had budget, a small budget, not big, to handle some of the faculty exchange and student support for that time we had students coming as a part of the agreement for the whole month of February, about 30 or 40. And I was getting ready to step down from administration. So that was the catalyst, I think, for that, because part of going back to teaching and after a sabbatical, which was 1997 to 98, was to not resume the responsibility for the summer school. That was Margaret and Carl Wagner, and that was fine. But the research relationship with the faculty and the University of Innsbruck, and by that time they'd already granted me kind of honorary status as a faculty member at the University of Innsbruck. So I still get always the rector's emails and brochures every month, which is nice. So we recreated it, and another Austrian friend of mine, Freddie Lugert from Vienna, who was a professor at, got his PhD in sociology, was here on sabbatical, or no, we just had an appointment for him for a year. He wasn't teaching at that time. And he worked with me and Günter to kind of shape the first ideas for it. Margaret's husband, Rolf Steininger, was involved. They were getting married at that time, and he said, "I love partnerships," because that meant that both of them would come back more often. Anyhow, and actually the full name, and he added this part, this is the Steininger part, it doesn't get used, but the full name was the Austrian Center for Culture and Commerce. And he added the commerce because he thought it would fold over into the economic side and business side of things. So anyhow, we even created the initial logos for it, and got the university to agree to end the old institute and start Center Austria. And so I was carrying on with that. We kind of guess that was been 96 or 7, because it was right before I went on sabbatical in 97, 98. And but I still kind of kept my hand in the development of it at that time. And I'm not sure exactly what year it was, but it was right around the same time after we began Center Austria, within a year or two. Günter wanted to leave the Eisenhower Center, and he had the position there as associate director. But now Doug Brinkley was there, and Steve Ambrose had retired in 95, I think, or 96. So Günter had great admiration and love and respect for Steve Ambrose, who kind of mentored him. And but when Doug was there, it was sort of a different orientation. And he said, "Can you take me over here at Center Austria as associate director? You've got the salary line, just got to get the people to agree." And Doug was okay with it, and the administration was okay. So that's when he started coming and working with me and helped out. Pretty much ran things while I was on sabbatical, and then kept things going. And I we'll get to this later, but I became chairman instead of coming back to full-time teaching, which was only 2 courses a semester. They hijacked me to be the chairman and CEO of the museum in '98. A wonderful moment. We were dead broke. And Ambrose says, "You got to get me out of this." You got me into it, but that wasn't true. It was his idea. Anyway, the chancellor said, "I'll reduce your load by 75%. And I said, "Oh, good, Chancellor." I said, "What does that mean? I'm only teaching 2 courses a semester, and this is going to be 80% of my time." He said, "Well, it means you get 1 course reduction." I said, "That sounds like a 25% reduction." Anyhow, I did it, and for 2 years on that basis. And then after the 2 years, Günter and I were working also on Center Austria, and I was teaching my 1 course. So that was still part of my responsibility until I retired from UNO in 2002. And when I fully retired, that's when Günter 2001 or 2. I mean, I retired in '02. I can't exactly remember when we passed the baton, but it was pretty clear that Günter was going to be the director, and that's made me very happy to see the continuity and all that he's did and has done. So,
well, we've already sort of started talking about it, so maybe we can talk a little bit more about this. The National World War II Museum is such an important institution in New Orleans, in the United States. You started to talk a little bit about its genesis. Could you tell us how did the idea come about, and how did your role in establishing it evolve?
Well, the short answer is I drank too much one afternoon with Steve Ambrose. And he says, "I got an idea for us. I've got all 1,000 oral histories." Of course, the number changed every week. I don't know if it was 1,000 or 600, but he had a lot of them. He'd been collecting for D-Day veterans. And he said, "I'm going to have my book out on D-Day in 1994, which will be the 50th anniversary. And you've just been named as president of the research park where Andrew Higgins tested the landing craft." And he said, "That's a historic site. It's free land. And we just built a little small museum." And he said, "But I need your help." Now, we had done a lot of things together in the past. We'd bought sailboats together, started a sailing school together. We bought a diving resort in Honduras together. We designed his D-Day to the Rhine tours in 1980. Plus, we sailed and hiked and camped and everywhere. So we trusted each other. We both had our different roles and different things that we conspired to do together. But so Steve says, "Great, okay, let's go do it. It's going to only cost $1 million." And I said, "Well, Steve, you don't know anything about these kind of things." 20-year administrator, I said, "It's going to be at least $4 million." So $400 million, and 33 years later, we are now the National World War II Museum. So that was the birthing moment, I guess. Was there at the creation, and now I'm starting today, actually, was working on the 9th chapter of the museum history, since I'm the last one alive who was there from that moment forward. But the idea really went back to 10 years earlier, actually, and you all are historians, so you appreciate the background history, backstory, as they say. So I've already started the Munich and then Innsbruck summer school, and had been working and we'd developed other international programs. So I felt pretty confident about developing, international education programs. And I knew Steve was just great talking about battlefields and World War II, and heard him in his classes. And we team taught a few, and I knew when he was at Johns Hopkins, he took students out to the Civil War battle sites, and I said, Steve, you've got to do a D-Day to the Rhine tour. And my friend Peter McLean, who's handling our summer school program, and all the logistics and travel, and with tour guides and logistics all taken care of, he will handle your tour, and if you ever do one. He said, no, I don't want to do that. So this went on for 2 or 3 years. And then in 1979, I think about that time, because the first tour was in 1980, Peter and I went to his house and kind of ganged up on him for about the third time. And he said the same thing, no, I don't want to do that, no. And I looked him in the eye and I said, Steve, I said, you've never been across the ocean except to the United Kingdom. You've never been on the continent. You're a military historian. I said, I think you're afraid you're going to run into a German you might like. And he looked at me and gave me that squinty eye. And he said, okay, I'll do it. And then he became great friends with a lot of Germans and Austrians, because he came to the summer school 2 or 3 times and taught for me. And General Hans von Luck, who was the Panzer commander that was cut off by the Pegasus Bridge landing, he got to know him because he heard about him, went and did his oral history in Hamburg, stayed at his apartment or house with him, brought him here. Günter organized conferences. We brought the Pegasus Bridge guys, glider pilots, brought von Luck here. Steve got him to write von Luck wrote his memoir. I think Steve has an introductory, a preface in it. And of course, I said in the same moment in the same conversation, besides that, you already have found, you love my parents, and both Germans. That was the coup de grace. Anyhow, but that led him, we brought famous historians, but we also would take veterans, D-Day veterans, and we found veterans for him to meet with, or that he knew that we should find along the tour. And that's when he really got excited about doing the oral histories. And when he went to the cemetery in Omaha Beach at the American Cemetery, was just totally blown away by that experience. I mean, Steve was a very visceral, emotional person in those kind of historic, sacred sites. And so he was there, I think, when Reagan spoke in '84 at Pointe du Hoc. And I think it was after that, it might have been the year before, but I think that was when he decided he was going to do the book on D-Day and start collecting oral histories and of D-Day veterans. And that's why he needed the Eisenhower Center, which we founded in '83. And and it was those oral histories which really led to the idea for the D-Day Museum. So that's sort of the backstory. And Eisenhower when he was editing Eisenhower's papers, he was not the lead editor, but he was the number 2. And Eisenhower wanted him because he'd read Steve's book on Hallett, General Hallett, who was kind of a Civil War administrator type under Grant, who he liked a lot. He liked the book a lot. And then he went to see Eisenhower at Gettysburg, and Eisenhower asked him, did you ever know Andrew Higgins? I see you're from New Orleans. And he said, no, he died in the 50s, and so I never met him. And he said, well, too bad, young man. He says, you missed meeting the man who won World War II. Ambrose almost fell off his chair. And I gave him one of those, and Eisenhower said, no, we had no, you know the story, but we had no landing craft. We could put anybody over an open beach at all, none. Coast Guard, Navy, Marines, none. They had 6 1898 boats that were used in the Spanish Civil War in training Marines in the late 30s. So Higgins was the entrepreneur who figured it out, a lumberman who had designed boats to haul cypress out of the swamps of Louisiana. Designed a boat that he knew he thought war was coming, and he got the contract and built 12,000 of those landing craft, and they were used in every theater of the war and were key to D-Day as well. And he also, the same design or a similar design, were used by the British for their boats. So it's a technological marvel. And I mean, just like the Jeep and the C-47 and a few other iconic Sherman tank, about 5 or 6 iconic B-17 instruments of the war, technologically, that was one of them. So that was another reason for him to focus on D-Day. Could also focus on Higgins and that story. And he got Jerry Strahan in the history department to write his master's on Higgins to help Steve along a little bit with that part of the research. And Jerry did a great job there. So anyhow, all of those things fed into that afternoon with too many drinks. And so I think he was thinking about retirement 5 years or so hence, and he wanted to ensure the survival of the Eisenhower Center. He thought if there was a little small museum that could support it in the research park and save the oral histories that he had. And he was also getting letters and artifacts, and not a whole lot, but enough. Parachutes, weapons, helmets, all with personal stories connected to the guys who wrote the stories. So he wanted those conserved and preserved. And so it really was a very small idea to begin with for the D-Day Museum. And it took 5 years before his resistance to the board before we agreed to move it downtown, and for the reasons that tourism was a lot more likely to sustain a museum than the university budget at UNO.
Most likely.
Yeah, and if I look across the hall and see where the Eisenhower Center is, he was probably right.
Yeah, so from there, you say you moved downtown. I was there twice now these past months. It's a huge building. I mean, not even going there twice for several hours, you will be able to really appreciate everything that's in there. But since you were talking about these interviews, I was actually looking for them, and I was a bit surprised not to find more of those D-Day interviews down there.
Really?
So, yeah, somehow. I found, okay, interesting, there is stuff, but like you say, the collection is huge. Where is that stuff? Is there like...
It's in our collections department. We've had them all the original Ambrose oral histories have been digitized because the audio tapes that he took them on were, I mean, you had one last run through, and that would have been probably the last run through because they were then, when we digitized them just about 4 or 5 years ago, they were already 25 years old. So they were all digitized. They're all categorized. Look, if you want to come down, I'll get you with the curator and the head of collections, because I know they're all there. And in addition to that, we've recorded 6,000 or 7,000 more on video, and we have probably 4,000 or 5,000 memoirs and diaries, papers, and those kinds of things. So the oral histories that began in the UNO History Department with Steve Ambrose and the Eisenhower Center have now grown tenfold. And it's probably the largest collection of oral histories on D-Day and World War II. It's no longer D-Day, just the first. Now we still took video histories of D-Days, but his collection was almost D-Day, whether it's American, German, French, British, mostly American, and all, it's supposed to be around 1,500 or so on the website that you go to a certain section and you can, and they've been classified so you don't have to listen in 2 hours. I mean, you can go to the training or the battles, the theaters of the war they fought in. And so I'm happy to facilitate the introduction and make sure that you get to see them all, because or at least find out where they are. So.
No, my question was actually directed more towards it's not just a museum that you have actually constructed there. It's also a learning center. It's just a huge place. Maybe you can just guide us a little bit through that. Okay. What did actually, from this little museum idea, how did it turn into this big thing that it is right now?
Okay, well, that's a good question. But remember that his first idea was to save the oral histories and to curate and conserve those for future generations. We began the museum not intending to be a collection museum. We had a small vault on the 4th floor for some weapons and artifacts, but we quickly outgrew that in the last, the first 5 or 10 years, and it began to explode. And in the last, after 15 years, we did a renovation of the whole 4th floor. Is now all collections. In addition to that, we have bought a warehouse for the large artifacts on the other side. We have created an institute for the study of war and democracy, which was my last parting gift, as well as a media center with all kinds of technological infrastructure for distance learning, two-way communications into conferences and symposium. And so the idea of convening scholars and historians and enthusiasts to hear great history of World War II, the origins of, the course of the war, and the legacies and meaning of the war, is all really what the whole infrastructure, the exhibits of the museum are there to support. We're finishing the last pavilion, which is Liberation Pavilion, this November. So something we thought would take us till 2010 or 12, till Katrina. And then when Hurricane Katrina hit, we changed the date to 2015. Well, now 2023, we're finally finishing everything that was in the master plan. But I think of the museum as almost a university. In fact, we are doing a master's degree online with Arizona State University, and had 250 grad students or so have already gone through it, and I think about 175 have gotten their master's degrees. If I were still there, we would have accreditation of our own by now, which we studied for 6 months since I went into my emeritus role. And we could easily do it. We're doing all the marketing for the degree for Arizona State, and we provide the faculty from our institute for half of them. We have also an education center for K-12 that focuses on middle and high school teachers. We provide materials online. We do, televised programs for teachers and students from our site into their classrooms all over the country. We do webinars, podcasts, every way we can push content and great history of the World War II era, and also comparative national studies. So we're just really at the launching platform, really. The infrastructure is there technologically. The human infrastructure is there in terms of the institute and the historians. The building part of the capital construction part is finally over with. And we have a presidential counselors group of historians and museum leaders, the best in the world, who come in once a year for a day or two to advise us on our programs and ideas for the future. So it's really kind of Günter always, to come back to Günter, he always thinks of it as a brain trust, a think tank for World War II studies. And I think that's a good conception for it. And he's a member of the presidential counselors, as is Alan Millett. So we still have a presence there. before I gallop off into the sunset, you know. And
how would you describe Günter's role as a presidential counselor for the World War II Museum?
He's great. He's the first European that we had, Austrian, on there. He, of course, brought the connection to Steve Ambrose in addition to my perspectives, but he had his own contributions. And one thing he helped me a lot with, I mean, he pushed it until I finally put on a conference on memory wars, we called it, contested memories of World War II, was the first name for the conference. Because Günter was really preoccupied with that for 10 or 15 years as a scholar, and he knew the players in Europe. There was a lot more interest in memory studies. The Germans had their own challenges with looking at their past and coming to grips with the Holocaust and their own responsibilities. Have actually done, you know, a very good job since late 70s and try the Auswirkung of their past to give them a way forward. I'd say better than we've done with dealing with working our way out of the Jim Crow years after the Civil War. So we got our own challenges there. So there's a lot of comparative things to learn from different ways. And of course, Steve Ambrose is a proponent of the so-called good war, along with Tom Brokaw and The Greatest Generation. And look, I'd say frankly, the museum point of view is, we think, strong historical narrative. We don't try to get too didactic in our core exhibits, but our conferences, we bring on all comers, and we have big debates, and that's what our conferees like to hear. But we are America's official museum for World War II. As a museum, and our interpretive approach is not a negative. It's not like we were imperialists and we committed atrocities too, and we did some bad things. We say that in the exhibits, the Japanese-American internment camps, and we cover that. The fact that we fought a racist regime with a segregated army that suffered great discrimination. Women too, and so we look at those things in the exhibits. We have letters, documents, artifacts, film to support those. But our core narrative is a positive one in the sense that it was a necessary war. It was a war to defend freedom and democracy. We didn't start the war. We were attacked. We should have perhaps definitely been more vigorous about alliances and partnerships in the 20s and 30s than we were. I mean, we abandoned the League of Nations that Woodrow Wilson had spent in his whole energies founding, and then we rejected that and went into isolationism. And we had our own share of extremism in the 30s from the communists and the Deutsche Bund and Father Coughlin and all of that. So we had everything they had in Europe, but not as extreme. And Roosevelt, the center, held for us, and it didn't elsewhere. And fascism emerged. So it's sort of an existential war, you might even say, and the Allied victory was much better than the alternative. So we come down a little bit on the good war side of things, and I think Ambrose would come back to earth and do something bad to me if if we enabled the exhibits to reflect all the criticisms of his work and what I genuinely believe is a fair narrative.
Maybe I'm just off topic a little bit, but it's an ongoing discussion not only here, also in Europe. What do you think is? I mean, you have been a historian, as we just heard, your entire life. You see that for younger generations. Everything that is important is just commerce, to come back to the second part of your naming of the center. What do you think is the role of history for younger generations in life? Do we even need that anymore? Is that over? Do we just need something else now in education?
Oh my! Don't get me started.
I know.
You know
just,
my answer is going to be
just a little bit on that, because it's all over the news again.
It is. I mean, I would say the profession of history in terms of student enrollments is maybe declining, but it's never been more important. I think part of the problems in our own country is the lack of investment in good history, both in secondary elementary schools. We just read a study about the 5th and 6th graders who know very little about their own history, about civics, about how government works. You can't have that in a democracy. It depends on an educated citizenry. If you don't have an educated citizenry that understands the foundations of your Constitution and the rule of law and the Bill of Rights, the freedom of speech and freedom of religion, and all of those elements that hold democracies together, then you're subject to the extremists on either side, communist or fascist, and they're still around. And I would just say authoritarian movements in general tend to move into a vacuum when there's a weakness of that of people. So history is vitally important. I think libraries and universities and history departments need to be greatly strengthened. It's I don't see the silver lining yet. I mean, I don't see the ray of hope where people are rushing in. I mean, you even find that legislators are now trying to influence curriculum in schools and take books out of libraries. I mean, what does this sound familiar to? That's not a good trend, and in fact, it's a terrible development. So, I think historians are more important than anything. Good writers and good thinking comes with the study of history or literature or the humanities. You know, and if you look at it just as simply as all the writers going on strike out in Hollywood, I mean, Hollywood's going to come to their knees, and they're going to find out that these people who write have and can think are the whole world sits on fewer and fewer of them. So I think long term they will. They're going to be more valuable. But look, if you think in the long term of history, the great sweep of history and the decline of the first democracies of Greece and Rome, literacy and education and sense of history went with that. Which came first is always hard to see, but the great writers of history and the Silver Age and the Golden Age and the end of the Roman Republic, you know, after the 1st and 2nd centuries, it just went away. By the time you get to the 5th century, hardly anybody could write, and the old classics, they had turned into the group of transmitters. They would take Tacitus and they'd boil it down into 50 pages. So those who could read could get the cliff notes, the summaries of the great. Nobody read Cicero anymore. They had to have abbreviations if you were an aristocrat. So. And then another century or two, even the Holy Roman Emperor, Charlemagne, couldn't write. He could only read. So that was pretty sad. So it took a long time. Now, it's not going to take that long here because we got technology to advance everything, either for good or bad.
Well, maybe a small silver lining. I forget the statistics, but the National World War II Museum is one of the most visited museums in the country. Is that you know them better? So where do those stand?
Well, yeah. So we are definitely a destination attraction in New Orleans. There's no doubt about it. We are ranked by TripAdvisor, which is the only rating system of museums and hotels and restaurants. People who travel with TripAdvisor all over the world. So it's a popularity poll, and it's done by who sends in their favorite places. So we're ranked I think we've been as high as number 3 in America and number 7 in the world. And I'm not sure what the ratings are this year, but they're always in that range, 3 or 4. I mean, the 9/11 Museum in New York kind of bumped us to 4 a few years ago when it opened. And remember, too, we probably have not as many visitors, so if you're talking about visitors, as the Smithsonian American History Museum, but those museums are all free. What's different about our museum is that we grew up in a very entrepreneurial mindset because we didn't have any operating funds coming from state government. We're not a state museum. We're not a national museum. The Congress did give us the official recognition as the official museum for the United States on World War II. So we have that in legislation. And we did get over time about $33 million of capital money, but we don't receive operating funds from the federal government like the Smithsonian museums. They get $400 or $500 million a year each museum. So you know, then we're running on a budget of under $100 million for, you know, under 1 million people a year. But I'd say we punch above our weight class in boxing terms, and it's good in a way to be in New Orleans because it's a Smithsonian quality museum, and people, I think, like it for a day or two or half day, whatever, to find this kind of quality of a educational and history museum in New Orleans.
Yeah, I think so too. It's a great place to go. Something else also in the middle of the South, so to say. I think we could talk with you for hours, but for the official part, maybe we can come to a close. And I would like to go back to our original idea. So, what is your favorite Austrian food?
Oh my goodness. Well, let me see. Schutzkropfen would rank right up there. Of course, Pfeffersteak is good, and of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Wiener Schnitzel vom Kalb. But those are all among my favorites, and most of them found in Western Austria. Great, but of course, Wiener Schnitzel in Vienna, of course, is where it all came from. But the thing about the Tyrolean food, and in South Tyrol too, is there's that little fusion between Italian cuisine and the Austrian that makes it pretty special. So I like, I love Austrian food. It's just, and I love the food in South Tyrol as well. So it's a little bit different, but it's just great food. Yeah, so you're making me wish I was back there right now. I mean, so I haven't been back since COVID started, and that's I think the first time since 1973. Since '73. I haven't been back almost every year, and sometimes more than once, and for entire summers. So, I started here as an assistant professor in European history with kind of specialty in German history and diplomatic, and loved being in Europe, and I created the summer school for selfish reasons as well as for international education reasons, a way to get myself back over there every summer, because they weren't paying me enough to get over on my own nickel. So that led to the summer school, and of course nobody thought that could be done here either at the time. They said I was crazy. So I think the provost was betting against me, but the chancellor wasn't. He loved it, and of course I think the summer school is still the largest overseas summer school of any American university abroad. We had some competition from another Louisiana university. Louisiana Tech had a program in Rome, about 200, and that was before we got going, that was number one. I really don't, I mean, I haven't kept up with that anymore, but most programs, as you know, are much smaller. So it's been a big part of my life and my family and kids, and kind of grew up in Innsbruck and went on one of the Günter South Tyrol trips, and my oldest son now at 7 liked the little ham sandwiches, so Günter started calling him Schinkenbube every time on that tour. And so anyway, it's, I feel like I'm part Austrian on my mother's side and also by profession and career. And I'm very, very proud that the history department supported me and all of this development, and that Mark is taking over, is going to keep this connection strong and growing, and I think it's as important a legacy for me as the National World War II Museum.
Well, thank you, Nick. I mean, these are amazing accomplishments, and I hope you're able to get over this summer and have some of those foods that you like so much. But we just want to say thank you so much for a really interesting conversation.
Yes, thank you. Also from my part, it was really interesting, and I hope to see you in the summer in Innsbruck.
Well, it won't be this summer because I'm on deadline for my book. So
okay. But
might be in the fall if I get the thing turned off. I might get over there in the fall, but I'm certainly coming next year, either spring or summer. And I'm going to do a tour to South Tyrol. So I'm going to South Tyrol, North Tyrol in World War II. That's my plan. The historians have both written books on the last 5 months of the war. The Brenner assignment by, what's his name? And then The Return to the Reich, which the Lichtblau at the University of Innsbruck is working on, but there's another good book, so both halves of that with the OSS operations at the closing months of the war in South Tyrol, then across the Brenner. So it's going to be 40 students, me. Maybe you guys will hang around and contribute. And
since I've also written a book about the end of the war in South Tyrol with the American occupation, yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, well, you'll have to send it to me.
Definitely.
I want a signed copy.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Today with us, Nick Mueller. Thanks for talking to us, and I hope to hear you all back for our next episode of
History Exchange.
Danke fürs Dabeisein.
Thanks for listening. We hope you'll tune in to the next episode. More information can be found at Center Austria's website, www.centeraustria.org.
Und auf der Homepage des Instituts für Zeitgeschichte der Universität Innsbruck, www.uibk.ac.at/Zeitgeschichte.